Before the Americans joined the war in Europe, and before the fighting started with the Russians on the Eastern Front, the Germans had only one target left to conquer: Great Britain. With advanced weaponry, German air raids were systematically destroying airfields and other military targets, and leveling London and other civilian targets. Churchill took his command center underground. Starting first as an air war, U.S. bombers joined with British bombers to return the favor and counter German air superiority. Slowly, the German army started to lose control of first North Africa and then their other conquests. Free nations joined from the Allied forces, and soon the major battles were fought from one side of the English Channel to the other. Naval and merchant marine transport ships carried troops and weapons to the front. Crossing the Channel and scaling the stone cliffs at Normandy moved the Allies into an offensive rather than defensive strategy. Land troops and tanks joined the air assault. Destination, Germany. Germans took a stand along the border of Belgium and Germany, known as the Battle of the Bulge. Soldiers on both sides of the battle suffered indescribable deprivations, fighting each other and fighting the intense cold.
The Allies advanced slowly but steadily towards Berlin. Once we'd broken through the defenses at the border, there were many dangers as we had to work our way through unfamiliar forests and wide open fields. My platoon worked on clearing the Siegfried Line for our tanks to pass through. Hitler had secretly built the Siegfried Line, consisting of interlocking bunkers, as an impenetrable defense. Buried in front of the bunkers were lines of deadly mines. By the time our troops had put Germany on the retreat, our recon teams discovered that many of the bunkers were now unmanned because the German army had greatly diminished. We knew our tanks and big guns could easily take out the bunkers, but not until we could locate and clear the minefields and tank tracks. One of the longest nights I had during the war was when we came upon a minefield. One man led us through. He had a pen line. The only way we could do it was to go single file, holding on to one another. The black of midnight, and he led 198 men safely through that field with the light of one small flashlight.
Thompson, Eugene Morris here. Those roads you cleared were really appreciated. I didn't know you back then, but I sure knew what it was to drive heavy equipment through difficult terrain, never knowing when a mine, a sniper, or a buzz bomb would be in your face. I was born in Walsenburg, Colorado, and spent the early years of the war at a deferred job in Grand Junction, working at a creamery that provided butter for the military. Not that butter wasn't important to GIs, but I moved from that job when I was drafted to the U.S. Army Company A, 8th Armored Division, 7th Armored Infantry Battalion. When our company was first sent into battle, I rode on a supply truck as we crossed the Ruhr River into Germany. Things were very different as we next crossed a pontoon bridge over the Rhine River. I was assigned to the company command half-track, an armored vehicle with regular truck tires on the front for maneuverability and Caterpillar tracks on the back to push us through difficult terrain. They put me on top in the ring mount with a 50 caliber machine gun and orders that under no circumstances was I to fire the gun while on that bridge. The German Air Force was trying to locate and knock out all bridges, both their own and the ones the Allies built to get us to Berlin. The Krauts had already knocked out all their own bridges, but we kept building new bridges for our transports.
That was another job I had, running the sawmill to make wooden planks for those pontoon bridges.
Well, those pontoon bridges were very inventive and did the job, but they sure were scary in the black of night.
Watch those small taillights ahead. That's the only way I'll keep this vehicle on this so-called bridge.
Man, those rails are too narrow to hold this half track. This is no bridge. It's just pieces of lumber lying under some boats.
What are you doing, you idiots?
I'm listening to the water. One of these things down where our half track's over them, any minute. One of them could go under and we could be drowning with our half track.
Oh, shit. How wide is this damn river?
How wide? How wide? I was thinking the Mississippi. But later, as we left Germany, we came to that same point, and the crossing wasn't any wider than the Colorado River at Grand Junction.
On the land we walked for days, carried packs and froze our backs. We slept in barns and under tanks, only engine born for us.
Airmen live a different way, trapped in tin cans hit by strafe. Parachute had better work, life or death with one quick jerk.
Our planes would get shot up so much that the fuselage and wings would look like a patchwork quilt after the mechanics managed to fix them up. Whenever a fragment or bullet hit a crew member, everyone worked frantically as instant medics to stop the bleeding, get oxygen to the individual, and still keep the plane in the air long enough to get back to base, all while trying to keep the guns fired. On one especially difficult mission, we had taken more hits than usual. My co-pilot went back to check on the crew. I was determined to get our plane back over the English Channel and to our base. Once I felt we were in safe airspace, I looked back to check on the crew, and the plane was completely empty. Everyone had parachuted. I jumped as quickly as I could, lost the plane, but the rest of us got back to base.
Lieutenant Faddock, I understand you were a bombardier in the recent Allied bombing of the German-occupied Rotterdam. How do you feel about that raid?
We did okay. The bombing was good. A few months later, however, things weren't so good. When enemy fire hit my plane during a bomb run over German-occupied France, I was forced to parachute out. I was captured on the ground in enemy territory by the Germans and taken to a detention camp.
Trinidad bomber pilots reporting missing in action. Missing in action is Lieutenant Robert Faddock, son of Mr. and Mrs. Faddock of Trinidad, Colorado, according to word received by the young bombarder's wife from the War Department.
For the next 30 months, my husband was a POW at Stalag Luft 3, a prisoner camp approximately 100 miles southwest of Berlin. Between 1943 and 45, nearly 11,000 men were held prisoner there. The camp later became famous in the movie The Great Escape, which was based on actual events that took place at Luft 3 in 1944, when POWs dug a series of tunnels and planned an elaborate escape, which was partially successful. Ultimately, Bob was liberated by Allied troops. Because they were airmen, they were treated differently by the German camp. Unlike the pilots captured by the Japanese, who were treated cruelly and tortured mercilessly, that's not to say it was a resort hotel by any means. 30 months is a long time. And the Germans fed them with what they had.
Which was damn little.
Bob returned home, and we raised 4 sons and 2 daughters.
All right, men. This is the B17 Flying Fortress, a 4-engine bomber. Your targets will be oil refineries at Merseburg, rail yards in Cologne, and a dozen of ordnance supply depots. You'll handle the daylight raids, and the British will be bombing at night. In the daytime, you'll be able to see your targets, and you'll be able to achieve greater precision. The Brits will be bombing in the dark, safer for the aircraft, but much less accurate. We don't always agree on these benefits of these tactics. Manfredi! Albert, Manfredi!
Sir.
Manfredi, at 129 pounds, you're just the right size. You'll be our ball turret gunner. Go ahead, climb into the opening under the plane. You see those foot pedals?
Yeah.
Go ahead and work them. Those pedals turn the turret to multiple positions. Grab the handle by the gun and get used to the movement of the gun. You'll need to train your body to work the foot pedals and aim the gun at the same time, under fire, at 30,000 feet and moving very fast. The enemy could be coming at you from all directions, and sometimes at the same time. Because you're under the plane, your visibility will be restricted from above, so you'll have to react very fast. And don't for a minute think that any of this will be easy. Your job is to keep your plane in the air so the bombardiers can do their job. Notice that the entire front of the turret is covered with plexiglass, which will provide you with as much visibility as possible. On the other hand, if enemy fire hits you, the glass is the only protection you have, which is none. It's thicker than the metal walls of the plane, but once hit, there will be nothing between you and the ground but 30,000 feet of thin air. Note that there's no room in your turret for your parachute. Your parachute will be stowed in the plane's cabin above you. The only way you can reach it, your parachute, is with the turret in the exact position that you have it now. When the turret is perfectly lined up, pull that lever, and your parachute will slide down behind you. I'm not quite sure how you'll be able to get into the position when you can put the parachute on, but at least that's the only way you can get to it. If your turret is rotated to fire on enemy planes, you won't be able to parachute out. You'll also need to be aware that if enemy fire hits the hydraulic line, the turret will no longer function. Additionally, if the hydraulic lines are hit, the plane's landing gear will not be able to drop. In case of a forced landing without a landing gear, you will be trapped and crushed in the turret. Any questions? Have a nice flight.
We flew that B-17 successfully for 35 bombing runs without being shot down. We always took heavy fire, of course, and at Merceburg we lost one engine when flak hit it, but we were able to make it back to base in Suffolk, England. We lost some crew members in action, though. All told, B-17s dropped more bombs than any other U.S. aircraft in World War II, carrying 640,000 tons between October 1944 and April 1945. I was a long way from my hometown of Morley, Colorado to serve my country. I sure got an education. I went in as a boy. I came out a man.
Manfredi, DeLuca. Flying in the Pacific Theater presented different problems. Probably the most difficult was the extreme distances out there and flight range necessary to get from base to destination and back to base without refueling. In some cases, planes were fitted with additional fuel tanks, which were used first and then jettisoned, thus making the plane able to remain airborne on the remaining fuel. This was especially useful on the P-51 Mustangs based on Iwo Jima. Every component of this plane was designed for weight rather than protection. When the enemy shot at us, the bullets went right through the plane from one side to the other and through any human that was in between. The skin of the aircraft was paper thin. If any of those bullets or shells hit a crew member on a bomber, there was mass chaos on the plane, which was often totally open to the elements with minimal oxygen and cold as hell. I was operations officer for my unit, so I was responsible for every aspect of every plane and crew, which was often, I planned the missions, handled dispatch of men and aircraft, conducted briefings and debriefings. I also provided and controlled personal belongings, because when I sent men into harm's way, they had to go anonymous. No identification or personal effects were allowed. While my unit was based in Hollandia, New Guinea, I had an unexpected encounter with one of the most famous aviators in history, Charles Lindbergh. It was a big secret that he was going to be there. He arrived without any announcement or fanfare. He was touring the Pacific and wanted to take a look at the planes we were flying, the P-38.
These P-38s were amazing planes that Lockheed had just developed for high-altitude pursuit. They were highly classified and top secret because of their twin turbocharged Allison engines for greater muscle, which compressed the air and helped the aircraft get to elevation faster and stay there longer. The only pictures I could get from these planes from Lockheed always had something covering the turbochargers. I had to come see these beasts myself.
My pilots were testing these new planes. There were things about the planes they didn't like. They wanted a longer flight range, for example. Covering the vast distances in the Pacific was a critical issue for pilots. Too often they ran out of fuel. They were close enough to be able to see the base, but had to bail out in the ocean and lose the plane. Lindbergh stayed with the 475th for an extended period, acting as an unofficial consultant, flying numerous missions to test the P-38 and formulating suggestions for improving its performance. Lindbergh conferred with crew members, mechanics, and spent a lot of time studying the plane's manual and specs. Lucky Lindy was known for his attention to detail.
Officer DeLuca, here are my conclusions as to how we can get greater range out of the P-38.
The suggestions included adjusting the fuel mix, lowering the RPMs, and making some interior design changes. Not all the suggestions were popular. However, when reviewed for safety, they proved to be safe. And Lindbergh was absolutely correct about increasing the plane's range. Lindbergh was a very nice, polite man, the lone eagle. He lived up to his reputation during this stay. He was friendly, would always say hello, but he really spent most of his time alone.
A successful military is a complex organization with millions of interrelated parts. In many cases, the Allied forces were victorious in both the European and Pacific theaters because they had more parts than the enemy's forces. On the home front, every citizen was committed to the war effort, from coal miners to factory workers to farmers to cooks to movie makers and musicians. Everyone bought war bonds, had victory gardens, and used ration books to share the limited domestic supplies available, making sure that the troops first had everything they needed.
Scalpel. Sponge. Triceps. Hey, do I sound like a surgeon? Well, I was. My name is Sam Massington, and I was a mechanic with the 328th Service Squadron, Mechanics and Repairmen, later renamed the 444th Sub-Depot, 303rd Bomb Group H, Hells Angels. We were based in Molesworth, England, and our role in the war was to repair or replace engines on B-17 airplanes. I was in charge of the engine shop. Over the 2-year period we were in Molesworth, we repaired over 1,500 B-17s, and all in that time, only 3 went into the bone pile. We wear these aprons so we can carry all the necessary tools with us. We don't have time to be going up and down for tools. When the damaged planes are pulled into the shop, we pull the damaged engines, replace them with serviceable ones, test everything, and get the planes ready to go again. Before we can release those planes, we give them one final test on a runway. We put the throttles to the stops with the brakes on and the RPMs at the max. We listen carefully for any misfire from a fouled plug or a bad magneto. Fully loaded, these planes need all 4 engines at 100% in order to take off with a maximum payload of weight. If everything isn't working perfectly, the planes will never get off the runway. We certainly can't let that happen once they're loaded. The damaged engines are shipped to the main depot in Liverpool, England to be rebuilt. A good supply of replacement engines helps ensure a quick turnaround, but skilled mechanics are essential too. One time, we pulled and replaced all 4 engines on a B-17 with different mountings, all in one day, and returned the plane to the crew for the next bombing mission. I think that was our record. As time for the Allied invasion, D-Day, neared, pressure increased at the Molesworth compound. We knew it was coming, not the details, of course, but they were sending us more planes, getting all of them serviceable. During those last 2 months, we rotated 12-hour shifts, 24 hours a day.
With all the young men off fighting, women had to fill in to keep the country going and to supply the war effort, whether it be running family businesses or working in factories to make the planes, tanks, and equipment needed by the troops. As Sam Massington and his crew were repairing bombers overseas, twice that many female crews were working at Lockheed to build, test fly, and deliver the new planes being sent off the line. The pilots for this work were called the Women's Air Force Service Pilots, or WASPs. Some of them had as many hours as the men did flying in theater.
I entered the war late because I was just 13 years old when the war began. My older brothers were all in the Army Air Force, and I also dreamed of someday being a flyboy.
You are the worst excuse of so-called pilots I have ever seen. How can I send you off to fight for our country? You're going to kill yourselves doing the practice landings before you even get off this bank.
As the sergeant continued to yell at us, one training plane after another came wobbling and skidding across the runway. And the sergeant got angrier and angrier, finally throwing down his notebook and starting to slide away. Out of the sky, our eyes were drawn to something approaching the airfield. Once closer to the field, we realized we were looking at a squadron of planes, just like ours, preparing to land. In turn, each aircraft seemed to float down to the runway and land like a swan, settling onto a calm lake. We couldn't help ourselves from noticing the perfect landing technique. We were so excited that we forgot about the sergeant still within striking distance. The planes taxied to a stop, and a bunch of really tiny pilots climbed out. When they reached the ground, they took off their helmets and long curly hair. I couldn't believe it. We had been decisively shown us by women pilots, and our sergeant never let us forget it.
Now that's how you land a plane, you meatheads!
Daniel T. Bluss was a machinist on the Alcyon. His duties included maintaining the ship's diesel generators, the machinery, and the guns.
When you're out at sea, you don't just do one thing. If something is broken, you fix it. When I first joined the crew of the Alcyon, the ship was headed to Europe, but it took part in the campaign in Sicily. We then crossed back across the Atlantic Ocean, through the Panama Canal, and out into the Pacific Ocean. The ship docked in Hawaii, where it was refitted as a transport vessel in order of cargo, equipment, and troops to be delivered to the next assigned location. Because transport ships were the lifeline for U.S. troops in the war, providing new supplies and men, they were also key targets for the enemy. During attacks, I was sometimes called to start up the ship's fog machines. We had 10 of those machines on board, and when there was an air raid, I had to make sure they were all started. We made fog until the ship was covered. Then they couldn't see us to bomb us. In the Pacific Theater, the Alcyon became part of the U.S. Navy's 3rd Fleet under command of Admiral William Bull Halsey.
Before we're through with them, the Japanese language will be spoken only in hell.
The Admiral was demanding,
Hit hard, hit fast, hit off.
when he was on scene, he kept an eye on everything. He wasn't a big man, but he meant business. We then went in making a landing or to offload cargo and equipment. He was very demanding of every ship and everyone to see that they did their jobs.
The Navy's 3rd Fleet with Admiral Halsey showed up mysteriously beside our ship in the Pacific. It was very strange. There was an air raid and all the smudge pots were lit to hide our position. You couldn't see anything. Next morning, there was Admiral Halsey and the entire 3rd Fleet. I was running into people I knew on with my Coast Guard work on the C.F. Hughes, the biggest transport ship in the world. Harry Sayre, Don Landman, my good buddies from Trinidad were all part of the crew. Our ship carried 5,000 troops with a crew of 500. I was a storekeeper aboard, and my battle station duty was #2 gunner on a 20mm gun, with a job of unloading the gun during combat activity.
I kept running into my brother George all over the place. Coast Guard. Ha! Hooligans Navy they were. I was with the United States Navy and also in charge of the ship's store. Our ship was the USS Marl, a concrete barge which was used as a supply facility at sea, storing and issuing supplies to American troops fighting in the Pacific Theater. George would bring the troops over, and we'd supply them with everything they needed, from ammunition to food to clothing. Every time a group would come on board for supplies, first thing I'd ask, anyone from Trinidad? Amazing how many home guys I'd meet. Only 7% of those in the Navy actually saw action. The rest of us were in transport.
Remember how little Orlando tried to get out of the Coast Guard once he was in? He wrote me a letter once asking,
How can I get out of here?
Ask me the same question.
I've got to get out of this. Tell me, how can I get out of here?
If I knew how to get you out, I'd get myself out. Actually, it wasn't so bad. We saw a lot of interesting places, met a lot of great guys. The most terrifying experience I had was living through a typhoon out in the middle of the ocean. We were tied together with about 8 other barges, being pulled across the ocean by this really big tugboat. We had just come from the Carolina Islands. First, the ocean was like glass, you know, perfectly calm. Then the water was like a washboard. Then there were these little whitecaps. Then the wind started thrashing us all over the place. The tugboat signaled they were going to cut us loose and pick us up in the morning. We went for 5 days in the middle of that typhoon, without food or fuel, just being moved around by the devastating winds. When the storm passed, we were alone. No tugboat or the barges in sight. Eventually, a destroyer came near looking for surviving ships.
We're coming to pick you up!
The rest of the message was muffled.
Say again!
Absolutely.
Okay, we got it!
What's he saying?
The captain wants to know how the World Series came out.
5 days and nights when I thought I was going to die, and all I wanted to know was how the World Series came out.
Robert John Tapia had just turned 18 in 1945 when he joined the Merchant Marines. Normally, the Merchant Marines is a civilian corps that operates commercial vessels in and out of navigable waters of the United States, transporting imports and exports during peacetime. During wartime, the Merchant Marines can become an auxiliary of the U.S. Navy.
The Merchant Marine Act of 1936. It is necessary for the national defense that the United States shall have a Merchant Marine of the best equipped and most suitable types of vessels sufficient to carry the greater portion of its commerce and serve as a naval or military auxiliary in time of war or national emergencies.
With the heavy loss of naval ships early in the war and the continuing strain on equipment and supplies due to the 2 theaters of fighting, the support provided by the merchant fleet to the U.S. military was vital in the war effort.
The United States is greatly indebted to the Merchant Marines. They are the military's 4th arm of defense. The number of brave mariners who served our country increased from 55,000 to nearly 250,000 by war's end. They took part in every landing in the Pacific from Guadalcanal to Iwo Jima and experienced great losses during the U-boat battle for control over shipping in the Atlantic, which lasted from September 1939 until May 1945. The Merchant Marines suffered a greater percentage of war-related deaths than all other U.S. services, with 1,554 ships sunk and hundreds of other ships damaged.
I served on several troop transport ships, including the Exeria and Santa Paula. On my first assignment, I sailed from Seattle, Washington, bound for one of the last major battles in the South Pacific. We were fully loaded with troops and equipment shipping out for Okinawa. Once we reached Okinawa, we unloaded, then reloaded, got ready to transport troops to another area somewhere. Because we were came under enemy fire, our ship carried 24 Navy gunners, 3 communication personnel, and 1 officer. We worked side by side to make sure that ammunition, supplies, and troops got to their destinations.
Despite the many jobs connected to every military unit, those in combat had to be prepared to fight. Sometimes when the infantry was deployed, those remaining on base, the clerks, the medics, the cooks, had to be ready to defend against attack. Back in the States, military hospitals took care of those most critically injured.
I was 18 years old, living in Amarillo, Texas, in 1943 when I received my draft notice. My name is Doyle Foreman. I joined a busload of high school classmates who rode to Lubbock to take physicals and report for duty with the U.S. Army. Because I lost an eye when I was 13, I couldn't go into combat. So I was sent to Fort Sill, Oklahoma to a special training unit, and from there went to Camp Chaffee, Arkansas to work in a hospital as a ward boy. Most of the work was routine, but occasionally something proved quite challenging.
Doyle, we need help!
A German prisoner was out of control. He was running a high fever and acting crazy. Really crazy. Even our biggest man, who weighed 290 pounds, couldn't handle it. Being over 6'4", I was often asked to lend a hand in these situations. We wrapped the man in chilled bed sheets to try to bring his temperature down. Eventually, it took 6 of us to get the job done. Then, they knocked him out with morphine. Working in a hospital at wartime, it's hard to know how many lives you've helped save, or how many terminally wounded men you were able to comfort. I worked in that hospital 12 hours a day, 7 days a week for a year. Everyone did. And no one complained.
Doyle, we've got a visitor on the floor. You might want to come meet him. He's in the amputee ward, saying hello to the wounded soldiers.
It was Joe Louis, world heavyweight boxing champion. He was a black man who had defeated the German, Max Schmeling. Now that was quite an embarrassment to the Nazis. We were all real happy to shake his hand. I was proud of my almost 3 years of service to my country, but I was especially proud of my older brother Dale, who volunteered with the U.S. Army Air Force, became a pilot, and flew 35 missions in a B17 over Europe. He flew back every time with bullet holes in his plane, but none of his crew was ever injured.
Stayed about 50 miles north of London, Alice May Bailey worked with the secret British military operation which was tasked with breaking German radio transmission codes. Although only 19, Alice was well suited to the work since she had an excellent education. Needless to say, the nature of her work was highly classified and dangerous. With her sharp mind and intense focus, she was able to help crack enemy codes. Her foreign language skills and the use of crib words to discern a code match was the critical first phase in breaking a code. As code breakers became better and better at their work, the Allies were able to thwart German strategic plans. Many times, Bletchley Park knew the German orders before the Germans did. Every day she was sternly reminded that under no circumstances could she tell anyone where she worked or what she did. If she was ever suspected of divulging classified information, she would be shot. Only recently, when the British Official Secrets Act expired, information on the wartime work at Bletchley Park was declassified. Alice received in the mail from the British government an official commendation acknowledging her work. Even now, though, she's hesitant to talk about the details of that period of her life. On weekends, Alice sometimes visited the nearby village of Saffron Walden.
Good evening. Do you mind if we sit here?
Please join me. Please sit here.
Yes, I am.
They talked for hours. And hours. And hours.
All right. I'll meet you here tomorrow.
I met William McDonald from Western Colorado when he was stationed in South Wales with the U.S. Army. I was standing by our family garden gate when he and his two buddies drove up. They were out for an evening of fun. They stopped and asked me for directions to the Red Lion pub, but then Bill, he just kept talking to me. That American GI and I really hit it off. He returned to see me the next evening. I was too young to go out, being I was only 16. So we just talked. When he came a third time, my oldest sister and a friend walked with Bill and I to the park.
GI Sam DeBono and I met in my hometown in South Wales.
Philbert and I continued to meet when I was off work. We sat in the park or took walks in the surrounding area.
Alice, my tour of duty is almost over. I don't want to leave you behind. Would you consent to at least write me?
We corresponded for 18 months. And then,
February 1947. To my darling Alice, would you come to America? I will send you money for the trip.
I was excited and scared at the same time. I saved up my own money, enough for a ticket home in case I decided I wanted to return to England.
Marjorie, my unit is being transferred to fight in Europe. I promise I'll write to you every chance I get.
Sporadically, his letters started to arrive. And of course, I wrote him back and I prayed that he would receive them. Our wartime romance deepened. When Bill's term of enlistment was up, he signed on for an additional year. He wanted to allow for me to get a little older so that we could be married.
When the time came for me to ask Marjorie's father for her hand in marriage, I was more nervous than I've been throughout the entire war. But he gave his approval. And on February 7th, 1945, Marjorie and I were married in the St. Wuthos Church in Newport, South Wales.
When Philbert greeted me at the Trinidad train station, he was wearing a different uniform.
I had taken a new job following the war with the city police department. Eventually, I served as sheriff of Los Animas County.
Philbert and I were married on April 15, 1947, in the parish rectory at Holy Trinity Church.
I followed Bill to Trinidad a year after our marriage, and we settled into a home in town. That was my father's one condition. He thought I was too young to live at the McDonald family ranch. So we first lived at 423 Colorado Avenue, which was great because every day I could walk down to the handy corner drugstore and buy myself a banana split.
3 years after my sister Marjorie moved to Trinidad, I came from South Wales for a visit. Just a visit. But I met and fell in love with Bert Heinlein. And when the wedding was written up in the newspaper, Sam, look at this. Peg Norman of South Wales. Do you know this guy, Bert Heinlein?
Of course I do.
Well, these two sisters are from my country. I have to meet them.
And we Warbrights continue to meet. Friends forever in Trinidad, Colorado. enlisted in September, had a brief training period in Texas and Mississippi, and was then shipped overseas. I entered the fight after the Battle of the Bulge. I was assigned to Company B, 16th Battalion, 1st Infantry Division, U.S. Army. During my time in service, I was a rifleman, squad leader, and platoon sergeant. The life expectancy of an infantryman on the front lines at that time was 7 minutes. The odds of me returning home were not very good. Following the surrender of the German army and official end to fighting, I was with the troops that liberated a number of Jewish concentration camps in Germany. And then I became a military policeman, serving with occupation forces until my discharge in July 1946. I saw things in Germany I never thought possible. Those experiences left me with a love of country and determination to keep it free, which have guided me my entire life.
Al's brother, Robert, served in the 8th U.S. Army Air Force as second radio operator, engineer, and waist gunner in a B-24 plane in the European theater. During his tour, he flew 36 missions. He and his crew were shot down 4 times, and they were listed missing in action twice. On one of those missions, they didn't return to their base for nearly 2 days. Robert was injured 5 times and was awarded 3 Purple Hearts. My youngest son, Roy, was drafted into the U.S. Army in January 1946, 4 months after turning 18. He spent his tour of duty working with the U.S. Corps of Engineers in Japan after the atomic bombs had been dropped. All of my sons returned home.
When my son, Calvin Quain, when he first became a sailor for the United States Navy, he was really homesick. I wrote to him all the time, but you know, one time I got 14 letters from him. Well, that all ended. Funny, you know. He got a girlfriend, and then he wasn't very lonesome anymore.
Like many others with brothers in combat duty, I was assigned stateside during my years with the Navy. One of my many tasks was to process records for all naval personnel concerning points earned during their overseas rotation. Points were earned for various things: months spent overseas, combat missions completed, medals awarded, number of dependent children at home, etc. Accumulation of a certain point total would earn a sailor the coveted transfer stateside. I considered my job to be just as important as the men who had combat duty. If it weren't for me, they wouldn't have been discharged from the service at the proper time. All of my brothers returned home safely and at the proper time after completing their service.
What I saw during the war, and even more what I saw during the liberation of Europe, are memories difficult to speak of. One memory, though, helps me remember why all this happened. When all the statistics and medals and memorials are complete, it's about the families, the humans, the people sacrificing for what they believed in, people sacrificing for freedom. Following VE Day and Victory Day in Europe, I was stationed in Lyon, France, assigned to take charge of a train transporting German prisoners back to their homeland. The same German trains that were used to transport Jews to the concentration camps. It was a quiet trip with only one stop along the way. We were supposed to get a new engine in Munich, but for some reason, it didn't arrive when we got there. So they pulled us on a siding to wait. I decided to let the prisoners get out and exercise. We watched the prisoners walk up and down the rail yard. I was approached by my interpreter, Eric, who was accompanied by a prisoner.
This man, a German captain, has recognized someone working in the yard, switching trains. It's his brother-in-law. He wants permission to go and talk to him.
Take 2 guards with you and report back to me. He and the German captain soon returned.
He wants to know if his mother could come to the rail yard tonight. He hasn't seen his mother in 5 years.
Tell him that that train can't be delayed. I don't know when we'll get a new engine, but there might be a chance we'll still be here. I flashed on the face of my own mother back in Trinidad, Anna Masseroti. Later that evening, still waiting for the new engine to be delivered, I watched as the prisoner's brother-in-law returned with his mother and his sister. So they had a reunion right there in the rail yard. Shortly afterward, the train's new engine arrived, and the prisoner had to say goodbye to his family again. This time, however, the separation was likely to be brief. At journey's end, the German captain and the interpreter sought me out. The captain reached out to shake my hand, and then Eric translated his words.
You're a fine soldier and a very good man.
Sgt Davidson, I want you to type up these orders for the 3rd Photo Reconnaissance Squadron to photograph 2 specific locations, Hiroshima and Nagasaki. I can't tell you the purpose for the mission, but I will tell you that by this time tomorrow, the war will be over.
To those of you who answered the call of your country and served in its armed forces to bring about the total defeat of the enemy, I extend the heartfelt thanks of a grateful nation. As one of the nation's finest, you undertook the most severe task one can be called upon to perform. Because you demonstrated the fortitude, resourcefulness, and calm judgment necessary to carry out that task, we now look to you for leadership and example in further exalting our country in peace. President Harry S. Truman.
This is to certify that
Albert Manfredi, Joseph Pobach,
George Ortiz,
Urban Barncole,
Sam Massington,
James Heinlein,
Louis Cusimano,
Daniel T. Blas,
Aldo Bassinelli,
Albert Manfredi,
Robert Fabic,
Albert L. Robinson,
Lowell Thompson,
Ruben Ortiz,
Eugene Morris,
Johnny Nicolai,
Frank DeLuca,
Glenn Ramsey,
Mike Armijo,
Johnny Baca,
Sam Tapia,
Tony Masseroti,
Robert Tapia,
U.S. Army,
Navy,
Coast Guard,
Marines,
Air Corps,
Merchant Marines.
is hereby honorably discharged from the military service of the United States of America. This certificate is awarded as a testimonial of honest and truthful service to this country.